So the relaunch today marks a point of both continuity and change for the journal. It sees the return of Identities to the UK. It's been in the US for the last 15 years or so. And it's part of a new and unique partnership with the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies. And we've very fortunately benefited from the experience and support of the ERS editors Martin Gilroy and John Thomas. And they've also led us their wonderful journal manager, Amanda, who unfortunately is not able to make. In the past 20 years, issues of culture and identity have moved to the centre of analysis across the humanities and social sciences, and also, perhaps more troublingly, to the heart of policy formation and political rhetoric, although not perhaps in the same critical ways that we might hope. The journal today seeks to explore contemporary formations and transformations of this arena to engage critically with questions of race, ethnicity, culture and identity globally. The first issue was published recently. There's a few copies outside on tables, and you can look at them in the beautifully redesigned sleek cover. And it contains articles from South Africa, New Zealand, India, the United States and Armenia. And our second issue will be online from Friday, and that explores questions in relation to Rwanda, Kenya, Indonesia, Britain and Spain. And the second issue also contains an article and interview by renowned American urban sociologist Herbert Gans. And that article, along with some of the others, are available to download free from the website, so do go and have a look at the website and see. Now, the aim of Identities is to allow space for dialogue, debate and exchange, to open up questions of race, ethnicity and culture through original, theoretically informed and empirically grounded scholarship. It provides an interdisciplinary space which draws from across the social sciences and which promotes critical engagement with these important questions across the boundaries of disciplines, across geographical and theoretical borders, across a range of themes, times and places. And we were therefore completely delighted when our speaker tonight, with my colleague Linda Tom of Sociology at the LSE, agreed to give this lecture to mark the relaunch of the journal. I think it's hard to think of another scholar whose work has been more significant to the issues addressed by the journal, and whose work captures the interdisciplinary, global, politically engaged and intellectually rigorous scholarship that we're hoping to attract and publish. Paul's work has been central to defining or redefining questions of race, culture and identity, from his very early work in The Empire Strikes Back through the late Black Enemies, to go over the whole amount of work. But through the paradigm-breaking Black Atlantic between camps after Empire, Baltimore and so on. And Paul's work has always had the power to challenge, to contest, to unsettle what we know and how we think, and to provoke. And I suspect tonight's lecture will also achieve that. So I'm going to now hand over to Professor Paul Gilroy.
Well, thank you, Claire, for such a generous introduction, and thank you to colleagues and students and friends and everybody for turning out this evening. Recent years have comprised something like a particular conjuncture in Britain's politics of race. The spectacle of racialised truths and ethnic conflicts endures, but it's been punctuated by a growing sense that analyses created in order to make sense of earlier struggles may have reached the end of their use. We need a successor approach, and it will have to be capable, on one hand, of rethinking the relationship between race politics and religious identities and neo-imperial international relations, and on the other, of factoring in the local effects of economic crisis without resorting to deterministic conceptions of the ways in which class is re-articulated. And if this overdue change of orientation is going to be rewarding, we're also going to have to revisit and work through some of the discussions which were muted during the New Labour period, when what I regard as the bogus proposition that the thematics of race and immigration could be easily untangled in Britain's political culture. That idea held sway during that period, locked into position by a mixture of alarmism, spin, opportunism, and some rather crude manipulations of evidence that have been exposed by Danny Dorling, by Moody Simpson, Nisa Finney. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what they've done. So this conceptual adjustment is likely to involve some other innovations too, a much more deliberate importation of approaches informed by racial and ethnic situations elsewhere. That's what I take the work of the journal to be doing, not only of in North America, which has stood for too long, I think, as a sort of sole legitimate measure of our country's racial future, but also other parts of Europe and of the wider post-colonial world. Similarly, a new balance will have to get struck between explanations of racialized and race-assembling politics that focus primarily on structural and institutional factors, and the need to confront novel forms of racism more consistent with the agentic, the individuating, the rights-based approaches to difference and to diversity that characterize corporate multiculturalism and neoliberal dogma alike. And those formations are interesting because they've been largely content to accept the privatization of racial grievances and of the mechanisms of their amelioration, exercises which have usually been facilitated by the expertise delivered from outside into government by specialist consultancies, of which more in a moment. Certainly, the resulting arrangement directs our intervention towards individual conduct, which can be characterized as racist and for which isolated perpetrators can be legally held to account. Another element in this, although not something I have time to go into detail tonight, will be the suggestion that the evolving, the changing ideology of Europe's populist and nativist right will also have to be examined on its own terms, rather than just dismissed, lest its critics take it more seriously than either its adherents or its advocates. And I think that, too, as the Breivik case reminds us, is a transnational phenomenon in which the theme of victimage has become an increasingly prominent counterpoint to fears of an Islamic takeover. Now, all of these issues seem to me to imply calculations about the relationship between past and present, and they ask in particular about where the boundaries of the contemporary should be drawn. A question that's been answered lately by invoking the everyday use of digital technology and social media, which have introduced some novel problems. As the I'll give a talk on double, that's what you have. As the errant Metropolitan Police have found to their recent embarrassment, those technological innovations have torn through the blanket of secrecy and facilitated the shocking discovery of unacceptable and criminal behaviour all around us. And with its high tempo, its ease of dissemination and transmission, digitalia, if that's the right word, has helped to present routine acts of racist commentary and violence from new angles and in unprecedented ways, distinguished always by the irrefutable authority of video. And there are other consequences too. I'm sure any among you who's been foolish enough to read through the comments that get posted underneath YouTube clips or articles on the comment tree will attest to the fact that anonymous internet interaction necessitates a different understanding of tolerance than the variety of tolerance that will be anticipated where contributor identities are verified and trackable. Online, racialized abuse has been compounded by transnational white supremacist crowdsourcing and is freshly typified in a provocative repudiation of the fashionable conservative idea that race thinking might now be consigned to the past. Domestically, the recent cases of Liam Stacey, I'm sure you remember that name, the young man who was jailed for his vile racist tweeting about the footballer Fabrice Mwamba, or Azam Ahmad, a name that will become familiar to you, I think, the week after next when he's back in court, who found himself indicted for a racially aggravated public order offence after he had posted a message on his Facebook page about how the death of British soldiers in Afghanistan was being reported, and then found that the charge he'd initially been faced with was replaced by a different offence under the Communications Act of 2003, or perhaps some of you have been involved in the Robin Hood Airport tweeting joke, which is pushing the boundaries of jurisprudence in this area. Okay, now what's going on here, it seems to me, is the emergence of new kinds of racial criminal conduct which have attracted the attention of the law thanks to a reconfiguration of public and private spheres. And I think here too, social scientists, we need some new interpretive tools which work better than the kind of thing, the sentiment analysis software, I'm sure some of you have seen Sensi Strength, this kind of thing, which is currently available. That sort of innovation methodologically is going to be needed if we're going to be able to evaluate the political impact of these transmissions and comprehend the communicative, the psychosocial networks that they assemble or arouse. There's virtual, there's immaterial racism routinely hosted on Facebook pages, on Twitter, on YouTube, and all of this underscores the difficulties in specifying what now constitutes public action and public space, as well as where the boundaries of the law should be in regulating public order offences and assessing the apprehension of violence and disorder, which is the thing which triggers legal intervention. Now, long after racism was supposed to fade away, racialised inequality remains. And both of them may have been intensified by the impact of economic misery and the hopelessness that accompanies it. These conditions have fed a popular enthusiasm for the idea of free speech, which serves as an important cultural marker, often bolstered by the ambivalent liberal and libertarian appeal of a nebulous right to be offensive. This is just a very short clip. I hope the sound works because there is a problem. We have a bit more volume, please, if possible. Thank you. It's rather bombastic, patriotic stuff. Other clip I want to play, which is, there's a hum now, isn't there? That's the one. Okay, let's see if I can do that. Right. Well, those freedoms, the right to be offensive and so on, are increasingly being restricted by government. But 30 plus years of anti-racist struggle and intervention have rendered the spontaneous and reckless outbursts of racist commentary entirely shameful. Nobody wants to be associated with them. Not even the murderers of Stephen Lawrence. I don't know if you followed their defence in court. They were shown the video of themselves 18 years before, and they were saying, how racist we were, how horrible, not racist. And I think there's something important about that. The leadership of the EDL similarly decries any suggestion of racism. I see Stephen Lennon. I always get muddled up between which is his real name and which is his pseudonym. Is saying that the answer to the danger of racist football hooliganism in Ukraine and Poland is for the police to allow those who've been banned from following the England team abroad to go and sort them out. How his mind works. Okay. The serious point is that racist rhetoric is too valuable a political instrument, too potent a source of populist energy, and it's the wreckage of old alignments to be completely set aside. It can, of course, be recast ambiguously and productively in commentaries on security, territory, culture, and religion, but if it's going to be deployed in that way, race talk must become respectable, and if possible, it should be scientific. Certainly, the kind of aggressive, xenophobic politics borrowed from the ultra-right have to be modified, massaged, adapted. And the denial of any racist intent that frames the retrospective assertion of good faith, always to be broadcast out from the hub of the official politics, has to sound plausible. To be honest, there may be genuine surprise when the unusual performative force of that racist language culminates, as we saw in Oslo, in terroristic violence. So this evening, what I want to do is to try and revisit something about the relationship between the demotic eruptions of racial hatred, which have lately emerged as a popular form of entertainment and instruction on our computer screens, if not our televisions, and the formal political pronouncements of our more recent political leaders, specifically David Cameron, on the subjects of race, multiculturalism and citizenship. Well, as you know, the 30th anniversary of Britain's 1981 rioting passed like the earlier commemoration of that epoch-making fire in New Cross, almost without acknowledgement. The rioting of August 2011 provoked a spasm of commentary, and opinion was very sharply split over the extent to which the events that had occurred in many of the same places 3 decades previously might supply insight into what had just happened. And great effort is expended on distinguishing the latest disorders from the rioting that went on between April and July of 1981, which is, I think, increasingly being viewed through the lens of hindsight and can sometimes even be considered as a comprehensible, if not exactly a legitimate response to the scale of problems that characterise that departed era, the era of police nigger hunts and the awful figure of the mugger as a folktale. The retrial of Stephen Norris's killers, some of them anyway, more than 18 years after he was murdered, also focused national attention on the relationship between the past and the present. And Britons were invited to discover, via the renewed judicial proceedings, how much our country had changed for the better during the intervening period, and in particular to see where or whether today's widespread revulsion at open expressions of racism might be used to convey a welcome measure of progress, something that would be visible with clarity in the context of chronic economic crisis, gloom, and despondency that recall the battlefield days. And when it arrived, that guilty verdict pronounced on Dobson and Norris was greeted as proof of the fact that the country's legal system, tainted by unwitting and institutional racism, the words of Macpherson, had at last been seen to have been repaired. And the degree to which that race-transcending humanity of Stephen's long-suffering parents appeared in our mediascape as a sort of shocking revelation suggested a rather different and rather less affirmative conclusion. Now, the Lawrence trial was interrupted by a number of events, as I'm sure you recall, by the murder of Anuj Bidve, shot in Manchester in the street, and also by the mobile phone video recording of Emma West's ranting on the Croydon tram. Was her outburst evidence that any comforting assumption of national progress had been mistaken? By going viral at that critical point and acquiring something like 8 million hits before the police asked the person who posted it to take it down. I'm sure some of you will have seen the responses, the satirical reworkings, the answers, the endorsements. Quite apart from the original text, there's hundreds of them there. You can go and look. In fact, the original's still up to someone else, of course. Once the police asked one person to take it down, somebody else puts it back up. So that's another feature of the environment we're talking about. And anyway, although nobody, I believe, made a complaint about Emma's behaviour in the tram, which seems an important index of the character of that multiculture manifest there, the British Transport Police went after her afterwards and arrested her, charged her with a racially aggravated public order offence under Section 4 of the 86 Act, and she was remanded in custody over the holiday period. Her children were taken into care. I think she's about to reappear in court next week. And judging by the fate of Jacqueline Woodhouse, 42, of Romford in Essex, who did a similar tirade and was imprisoned last week, it's likely what the outcome of our proceedings will be. Okay. Now, right. I mean, there's a lot to say about that performance in the tram, and the largely, I would say, tolerant responses of the other passengers in what remains a key public space in the expanding everyday culture of lived privatisation. But before we can get into a discussion about the video in detail, I think I want to address Emma's lamentation of British decline and her emphatically personal pronouncement of that loss in the political settings provided by official declarations of British multiculturalism's demise. And the context for that is that across Europe, respectable parties seeking the populist magic of that rising ultra-right have adopted the xenophobic, the anti-Islamic rhetoric of the hateful neo-fascist fringe, and multiculturalism, which is such a blurred term for a host of different woes, is repeatedly declared dead in that setting, often as part of an anxiety-inducing argument about security or national identity, and, above all, an argument about the menace of Islamic extremism. How much those noisy death announcements actually refer to the ideological formation itself, and how much they're aimed, as it were, prospectively, wishfully, at the fact of cultural plurality itself, has always been unclear. I'm sure we've had different views about it. Certainly, contemporary Britain's lived and unruly multiculture is plainly and irreversibly evident in our metropolitan centres, and it's mirrored in that motley cast in Emma's tram, which I think we should remind ourselves about. Now, I don't know if the sound is going to be adequate here. I hope that you'll be able to hear it. It's a 2-minute clip, and many of you, I'm sure, will have seen this several times before, but just as a refresher, let me play it. Well, my apologies for the sound quality. If you want to verify it, it's only 2 clicks away from you wherever you are. But if you do want to look at it now with your earphones in, keep volume. Okay, well, if multiculture is dead, multiculturalism is dead, the organic diversity lives there, and its dynamic life after death warrants identification as what we call the zombie phenomenon. And it seems that, in particular, those menacing spectral figures of tropical modernity provide an appropriate avatar for vernacular culture here and now. And like Britain's undead diversity, zombies are terrifying to the power and destabilising of the order that pronounced them dead. And their resilient labour, their superhuman physical strength, their apparently limitless aggression, bespeak a historically unprecedented perils and corrupting cultural contamination of those unfree Creole formations. Marina Warner and others have reflected on zombies and how they manifest a ghostly physical presence which can be sharply differentiated from most other kinds of spirit agency by being embodied hyperactively in the absence of any corresponding consciousness. Again, like London's unruly multiculture, they grow, they reproduce without the mediation of cognition or any ideological reflection. Their actions are like those of vampires, controlled by powers that are wholly external to their being, and their association with carnival is, of course, legendary. They can therefore, I think, be seen as sort of successors to the Frankenstein child creation, which, assembled from the waste products of industrialization, offers such a potent figure in the 19th century for the destabilizing agency of the proletariat. Now, David Cameron's Munich speech of February 2011 rehearsed all of multiculturalism's official obituary with some timely civilizationist flourishes. And his disingenuous words will be echoed in Emma's less polished outpourings, to which indirectly I would suggest they gave rise. His bid to instrumentalize the theme of failed, corrupting plurality results in that contested concept, multiculturalism, acquiring a new prefix that emphasizes its orthodoxy as an ideology. Multiculturalism becomes, in Cameron's speech, state multiculturalism. And extending a species of argument established by new Labour tribunes like Trevor Phillips, subsequently endorsed by a succession of Home Secretaries seeking the electoral alchemy of dog-whistling Thatcherite populism, Cameron links Britain's loss of its inclusive and compelling national identity to the urgent problem of establishing a new way of managing cultural difference. Without irony, and this is a largely irony-free zone, he baptizes that initiative muscular liberalism. Okay? Which is odd because it suggests an idea of liberalism as sort of tubercular, which I'm not sure I can accept. Anyway, the proposition has a suitably 19th century ring about it, as you've seen, and it's only this course of action which, as he says, is capable of conquering white Britain's widespread fear of condemning the objectionable views held by non-white people. His words suggested that the fear he speaks of, the fear of condemning non-white people when they have objectionable opinions, had itself been somehow induced by an intimidating multiculturalist ideology, proselytized by the non-whites, and furthermore, that at source, I think, there was a fear of being unjustly labelled a racist. Let's look at what he said, one part of it anyway. I won't read the quote out, you can read it at your leisure. The point really here is that Cameron's patiently illiberal and contradictory unanimism merits analysis. His repetition of the word frankly is a bit of symptom. There's a kind of peculiar discursive currency acquired here by his choice of the term values, which is so sharply distinguished from mere views and practices in this dismal scenario. That indication of values is really important to us because it creates a hierarchy of culture to displace all the horizontal presumptions of a simpler social plurality. We do, I think, need to unearth the sources of this fear that Cameron describes and learn how its genealogy relates to racist staples such as the polarization of the world into whites and the rest, as well as to the fundamental view of non-whites as not only incorrigible, but also ineducable, and therefore unassimilable. Now, his dubious claims are betrayed by the disregard of imperial and post-colonial history. That should, I think, be given. But that very wrongness in relation to reality is their essence. So correcting it offers no answers to the enduring political resonance, which increases with every iteration of the standard lexicon of racist images and cues. And long before the changes triggered by September the 11th, 2001, an extensive record of prosecutions under British race relations legislation demonstrated that no government in this country has been slow to rebuke illiberal minorities, with a variety of instruments, legal and otherwise, nor has any British government ever encouraged our country's irreconcilably different cultural groups to live separate lives, apart from one another, and distinct from the mainstream. That, I think, rather US-minded approach to diversity and social divergence might itself be thought somewhat outmoded in contemporary conditions that make that fixed cultural mainstream ever more difficult to isolate and to police. Not very long ago, the balance of forces on the racial horizon was presented really in a very different way. Margaret Thatcher had, after all, conjured up the populist magic of disavowed racial politics through this terrifying prospect of Britain being swamped by a rising, corrosive tide of alien culture. The final reason why our country has not, as Cameron suggested, enjoyed all the dubious benefits of state multiculturalism is because there's never been any such political ideology. Professor Lord Parrott may have aspired to design an apparatus of citizenship along those lines, but his substantial report was irrecoverably ridiculed by the very interest that had commissioned it. So Stephen McPherson, who ventured uncertainly into the territory that his predecessor Lord Stormont wouldn't enter, stopped short of engaging those problems of minority group rights and recognition. And anyway, with that recent history in mind, I think it's very tempting to conclude that any discussion of state multiculturalism should be very, very carefully confined, perhaps only to those rare occasions when the generation of race activists nurtured after 1981 in the bosom of Labour local authorities moved beyond municipal walls to sell their newfound professional expertise as diversity and equality consultants to a wide range of public and private and corporate clients, including the British Army, the BBC, the police forces, and the NHS. their view of how racism could be managed by governmental outsourcing of anti-racist endeavour was emphatically and comfortably statist in character. Their symbiotic relationship to power necessitated that orientation. It provided the bearings for New Labour's authoritarian nomophilia. It guided Blair's programme of privatising governmental functions and responsibilities, which would be freshly infused with equality of opportunity. And there is a trajectory in the political lives of this important cohort, which can be illustrated through reference to the careers of exemplary figures. I've already mentioned Trevor Phillips, let me mention now Linda Bellos, the latter who has been deeply involved in the corporate kite marking and further professionalisation of these areas of consultancy work through her role as a founder and chair of the Institute of Equality and Diversity Practitioners. I want to emphasise that Bellos, whose political activities traverse feminist organisations as well as the Labour Party, isn't being singled out here. Many other influential and respected figures of the same general vintage have followed parallel paths into the respectable world of corporate managerial commerce. And I'm sure that all of them imagine that their contemporary activities, as what the South Africans call, the South Africans have been seeking their own critique of their own accelerated exposure to neoliberalism, and they christened this kind of behaviour the behaviour of tenderpreneurs. So there's a generation of tenderpreneurs here, and I think the tenderpreneurs are an interesting phenomenon in the context of class politics, of race and citizenship, and they are, as a group, I'm absolutely confident, people who will tell you when they hear that they are doing exactly the same things now as tenderpreneurs that they were doing before as reformers, even critics or revolutionaries perhaps, I don't know. Certainly that contingent of New Labour and noble activists that assumed self-conscious shape after the 80s riots might reasonably be suspected of producing the fear of speaking out against the unacceptable habits of non-whites that Cameron is talking about. But his projection of that fear, which as I've said is really the fear of being denounced as a racist, needs also to be seen in the context of its immediate predecessors. Fear of being criminalised as a racist has been at the centre of Enoch Powell's 1968 River of Blood speech, and again delivered in the run 10 years later at the 1979 election. Margaret Thatcher warns about the violent consequences of being swamped, and that's the second instance. A third one, last summer after the riots, would be something like David Starkey claiming to have identified the transmutation of Britain's ever vulnerable whites into blacks through a process of cultural subsumption. So again, you see the same mechanism of being drowned in someone else's culture, which somehow takes you over. That's the zombie, the other part of the zombie metaphor. That's what zombies do. You bite them and you become one of them. Okay. Now, Cameron's language, as you saw, appears to have moved away from the menace of Powell's and Thatcher's language, which deploys absolute ethnic difference vividly in order to emphasise the social costs of cultural incompatibility. And we must confront the fact that unlike Enoch and Maggie, Dave is suspected of having lived life to the full in multicultural venues like Oxford's celebrated High-Low Cafe. I don't know if anyone knows that place. The trajectory of his hedonistic generation means that he's in no position to repeat the traditional xenological admonitions of the Tory right, and Dave's well-publicised appreciation of reggae, confirmed here by a native informant, serves his electoral project by marking his break from the Tory party, preventing him from telling blacks to flee from the conflict which will follow their unwanted post-colonial intrusions into British peace and quiet. The line is being drawn in a new place. Well, his appreciation, or apparent appreciation, I should probably say, this is being attacked, his apparent appreciation of some of the more exotic pleasures of living multiculture means that there can be no suggestion of expulsion or repatriation. And instead, following the logic of civilizationism, he asserts a rigid hierarchy of elective cultural attachments that are conveyed in that term values. And that key term emphasizes the social and historical character of societal differences and echoes the government's commitment to a strategy of integration, which is now going to be engineered from the top down. This is the sort of thing that the consultants offer the government you can use it as a sort of orientation point. This is taken from the government's latest documents on how integration is going to proceed in this country. Obviously, it's a different version of the alchemy of all of this than the new label. Okay. Well, what's interesting about Cameron's discourse on value and on fear is that it's been inflated so as to accommodate an explicitly racial schema. And that racial schema is rendered, as you saw when you looked at it, in the crudest possible binary configuration, white and non-white. And I think, to me, that was a surprising turn, something that recalls processes, discursive figures Stuart Hall had identified long ago as inferential racism. I think it might be helpful just to spell out the chain of raciological meanings that you saw secreted in Cameron's version of the civilizationist liturgy. Let me just run through it quickly. State multiculturalism, though now extinct, was entirely responsible for Britain's growing social segregation. We British are rightly and strongly against racism when it's articulated by whites. Whiteness, well, what whiteness is here is also interesting. It's understood really as a natural descriptor. It's not a social phenomenon. We've become, for reasons that we're not able to explain, fearful of applying the same standard of criticism to whites and to people who are not white. And the troublesome non-whites who dwell among us are incorrigible, and that condition must be transformed by this robust muscular liberalism that supersedes any passive varieties of tolerance associated with traditional conservatism. The attachment to certain core values, particularly freedom of speech, now defines the central mechanisms of national belonging, and it's those values, rather than any access to formal citizenship, that are now fundamental. People who do not practice those values actively have no place in our integrated and our integral national community. So you can see that in that scheme, learned rather than autochthonous attachment remains a technical possibility, but it's overshadowed by the traditional movement to expel. So, the cohesive society that Britons are told we must create if we're going to be secure squeezes the social space previously taken up by sojourners and denizens, not to say benefit-seeking freeloaders. And any move that those unsavoury types may make towards belonging among us requires their active enthusiasm for our values, as well as a firm commitment to national seriality. If they have no place amongst us, they do not belong if they do not practice those values. And if they don't practice them, they should leave. Now, I don't want to go on about Enoch Powell, I always talk about him too much. When he was in his pomp, he went on Desert Island Discs. And I noticed the other day that on the iPlayer, you can go back and listen to Enoch Powell on Desert Island Discs, which is a kind of symptom of its own, actually, given the general argument I make. Certainly, the great rhetorician, Powell, never really talked about whiteness in the way that Cameron does in this speech. Margaret Thatcher never talked about whiteness. So what is it about this concern with whiteness that we need to see it as a historical marker? And I think that historical detour is required by the need to consolidate the sort of thematic parameters of what's going on in the tram with Emma. And I want to turn towards that now. I think there are things to be said about its strongly gendered character, which will also help us to appreciate the significance of another big change. Racism has ceased primarily as something that men did violently to one another after the pubs are shut, or on the football field perhaps, hence John Terry and co being taken to Auschwitz on their way to the tournaments in Ukraine and Poland, which was announced a couple of days ago. Racism becomes more legible, more potent by being conveyed through interaction between women. Regardless of whether or not she was a real person, that marooned black country Britannia in Powell's imagination established an important precedent in what we might call the implotment of English victimage. She was not only beset by that marauding regiment of wide-winged pickaninnies that had marched out from the recesses of his colonial subconscious to accuse her, wrongly, of being racist, it was also the case that she was a victim of a misdirected government intervention that made it possible to turn her into a criminal. Okay, now I think this question of where that gender thread runs through this story is something we have to say much more about. I've written elsewhere about Cheryl Cole, and I'm sure that she has many fans here. But I'm not a fan of hers, and I always remember her assault on Sophie and Botka, the ladies' toilet attendant, Surrey nightclub in 2003. People are much more inclined to forget that history in an era where Geordie and Nigerian born can be made to function as sort of symbolic equivalents, closed identities with the same essential ethnic valency. The vulnerability of white womanhood today is signalled less through images of aged or infirm old women preyed upon by feral mothers in dark streets. Those constructions have been replaced by images of younger women, usually being street-groomed into the machinery of sexual exploitation by menacing Muslim men, a prospect that the EDL and similar groups find particularly fascinating. And that post-colonial cavalcade of white female vulnerability is interrupted, caused by the spectacular tragedy of the Lawrence family, figured in its most powerful incarnation as the tale of Doreen Lawrence's compound losses: the loss of her son, the loss of her marriage, and the loss of her touching her anachronistic faith in British justice. And that historic wrong is composed from the substance of her femininity. It yields a forlorn yet combative portrait of bereaved motherhood, and it provides the conduit for belated acknowledgements of her traumatised black humanity. Emma West, as you've seen, is also a mother. Her young son is on her lap while she's sounding off, and his presence becomes an important issue in the way that the other people in the tram interact with her, respond to the eruption. Junior's silent involvement in his mother's speech compounds her crimes, confirms her deviancy. However, to understand that and the mesh of class and gender and nationality and locality that inframes the lament, we have to make a second detour. And I haven't got time to give it, but in the bit, when it comes in the magazine, you'll see the longer section here. There's a section that follows here about Jade Goody and Bermondsey and the Big Brother house, in particular the conflict between Jade and Shilpa, Shetty, the Indian, the Bollywood actress, and the arguments about, parliamentary questions on Jade and Shilpa, the trade relationship with India and England at stake. Gordon Brown was in India actually at the time that the whole thing erupted, and he made a suitably serious comment on it. New standards are established for the ways in which corporate bodies like Channel 4 and Endemol, mates of the programme, were going to be expected to respond to the charge that they had created or used racism for their game show participants as a means to increase the number of viewers, which grew, if you recall, the conflict between Jade and Shilpa from 3.5 million to 5.7 million while the racism controversy was underway, something, of course, the advertisers were very, very happy about. Caught in the eternal frame of YouTube, those bizarre exchanges between the women about stock cubes and cooking and shopping, who was stuck up, who was a liar, who could speak English properly. These things can be read, I think, for the way that they illuminate the contemporary recomposition of class and gender, of class inequalities, registered in the changing cultural habits, languages, and tribal affiliations of young women. And their xenological detail affords opportunities to anatomize the forms of social hierarchy that are now judged acceptable in the context of a neoliberal order that thrives on the brutal division of the world into two great big teams, the winners and the losers. Yet the details are in a way irrelevant here. What's much more important is the simple fact that women's unpleasant interaction stimulates its viewers to interpret and to condemn racist conduct, rather than merely finding guilty pleasure in it, and a seductive righteousness in its repudiation. There's an interpretive puzzle presented here to which the easy designation racism supplies a sort of facile yet compelling solution. And that convenient outcome obstructs a host of other more difficult inquiries. What were the limits of free speech and hate speech to be in this artificial setting of the Big Brother house? Did the law confirm with the imperatives of the market in reality TV entertainment? How were those ways of speaking and acting manifested within a moral economy of popular television? What exactly was racism in that virtual world? Where did it diverge from the normal, the acceptable, the poisonous, everyday rhetoric of bullying, banter, know-nothing Brit nationalism, which is still its constant counterpoint in our schools and in our workplaces, but not, of course, here? This history communicates important changes in the way that women interact in a post-feminist public space, which go much beyond the scope of what I want to say this evening. But they do provide a suitable angle from which to reconsider the case of Emma West, an unwitting racist Madonna in the tram, which is always already a test of the lived unruly multiculture and the vernacular cosmopolitanism to be found on the southern edges of London. And that clip, the clip that makes Emma into a political celebrity, the clip that gets her dubbed Joan of Arc by Britain's loony right, begins arbitrarily. None of the other passengers, as I said, made a complaint about it. We can only guess what precipitated her opening salvo. She doesn't stray very far from the standard script reproduced on countless racist and neo-fascist leaflets advocating repatriation of aliens. And she appears willfully unable to entertain the possibility that a person might now, even now, be considered both black and British. So much then for the banality of multiple identities. What's this country come to? A load of black people and a load of fucking Polish. Is that initial inquiry one question or two? Is that initial inquiry one question or two? Certainly the inclusion of Poles in Emma's inventory of national decline shouldn't be misinterpreted as a sign of progress away from a racial order. It's followed by a number of negative judgments on the various fellow passengers' right to belong to the nation. The denunciation, you ain't English, gets repeated, and it's then combined with Emma's ritual enunciation of the morbid injunction beloved of British racists. Go back to where you come from. The trans-demotic multiculture gets petrified and intractable in the face of that rather unexpected venom. The second part of the tape I find particularly interesting. It's there that her sort of national threnody shifts from England to Britain. And she emerges there as a sort of hapless victim of this misplaced multiculture that arises from unrestricted, unwanted immigration. The impact of these unself-conscious transitions results in the country's proper name dropping momentarily out of her discourse. It's nothing now, she returns, bleakly. And before we have time to recall what the exact subject of the sentence might have been, she glosses it with an important sequence of very mournful comments. Britain's nothing now. Britain's fuck all. My Britain is fuck all. Her tone ascends with that final conclusive observation, and she has taken personal possession of Britain in a way that means we can't just be content to classify these remarks as though they were the same old non-specific request for the restoration of national greatness that we know from the template of a speech Mrs. Thatcher made at Cheltenham after the Falklands War. Britain gets changed by the idea that it's amenable to Emma's personal ownership of it. There's something sort of neoliberal consumerist about that relationship. It's now my Britain. It's her Britain. And with that change of scale, a particular history of class injury comes into view as well. There's a kind of Volkish melancholy, which is there in equilibrium with Morning's more pathological variants. But it's too simple to claim that her declamation is just a sort of nostalgic expression for noble but anachronistic white working class identity. For one thing, that key term identity requires complete disaggregation. And for a second, when did the working class acquire the quality of whiteness? As I've said, it was absent from what Powell said, it was absent from what Thatcher said, but it's abundant in what Cameron now has to say. It's reconfigured, of course, in his speech by the new task of racializing a perennially alien Islam, of projecting problematic Muslims, extremists, as non-white. And those ways of proceeding, I think, rather oversimplify the task of sociological analysis, particularly when it becomes fixated on the spurious governmental metrics of cohesion and integration. Emma's commentary is delivered also from the oldest, the pre-war garden village section of the new Addington estate. It's a very particular place. It's a place with its own micro-histories of tenure in property, a place of carefully stratified class making both at home and at work, and it suggests a number of issues. Some people who've been doing work recently on the right and its modes of organisation in this country suggest that when these ultra-right groups move into a neighbourhood, they don't try to access the working class. It's not what they're trying to do. They get the I suppose it's now the digital equivalent of the yellow pages, and they look for builders, they look for roofers, they look for plumbers, they look for people who are part of a very distinctive economic stratum, and this is a group which is very strongly represented in the Boots estate, which is the part of the New Addington complex from which Emma has emerged. Now, that kind of attention to the locality, the context, helps to identify the nature of the losses that are at stake in that move from a general sad observation, Britain's fuck all, to the much more specific My Britain sparkle. Emma insists, as you saw defensively, that there's a difference between her and the interlopers that she recoils from, but it can't be mapped onto the morally charged distinction between workless and minimum wage worker, between work-shy Brits and black or Polish replacement population. Emma is no stranger, and her combative stance complicates the issue of class attachment. Common wage labour and shared class exploitation are not capable of connecting people across the unbridgeable divide of absolute cultural alterity. And it may help to say that whether or not she considers herself working class rather than somebody who works, her class or class fraction does have its history of small and significant victories to set alongside that narrative of exploitation which anchors its contemporary sense of victimage. The social model put in place by post-war Britain's welfare settlements might be among the first of those. The transfer of wealth involved in the privatisation of social housing, the thing that sealed Thatcherism's social and political compact, might be understood as a second moment of that sort. Certainly seen last winter through the smoky post-right vista that somehow confirms national decadence and decline, it's the absence of any such compensation and the related disorienting realisation that her young son's life will not be better or richer than her own that cements that resentment and confirms him as an extra in her public drama, something that her interlocutors challenge. Another white woman uses her own position as a mother to challenge Emma's legitimacy in speaking for all whites. And real anger, I mean, let me emphasise the point about tolerance, real anger only really surfaces momentarily when Emma falters over her announcement that Nicaragua must really be where niggers have come from. Now, she does lick her lips, and the way that she behaves is suggested to a number of commentators, certainly in the YouTube comments, that her mouth is dry, she may have been intoxicated, self-medicating perhaps. The Croydon Advertiser, the local press reports about this, tell us that she was admitted into psychiatric care last September. She's been treated for depression since the age of 18, but not in itself a remarkable development in a country that boasts the unhappiest young people in Europe, some of the unhappiest young people in Europe. And even if we accept the medicalisation of her crazed outbursts, we must account for its peculiar idiom. In one tiny echo of the debate around Breivik's culpability, we need to ask why, if Emma is mentally ill here, her illness would have presented itself in that particular set of symptoms. Why was it that her evident unhappiness, her palpable anger, her bitter resentment could be articulated spontaneously as a heartfelt commentary on race, on nationality, and on belonging? Now that answer to those conundrums does not reside only in the subcultural habits of white South London, which some half-baked anti-racist approach might imagine that Emma represents or embodies. I think it's better sourced to a tradition of English political speech, in which racism is loudly disavowed while the speaker seeks simultaneously to instrumentalise it. Cameron has drawn into this, not so much as a believer, but as a mimic. And I think the results of his pseudo-Schmittian distinctions on cultural values, to belong here is to believe in these things, is indistinguishable from the exclusionary consequences of Emma's conviction that blackness and Britishness are mutually exclusive. Given permission to sound off by Dave's weasel words, Emma invokes race just as crudely as he does. His distinction between white and non-white makes her tram experience a matter of black and white. They arrive at the same destination from their different directions. They collapse the distances between biology and belief, nature and culture in an instant. And for both of them, the problem of belonging looms large in the political ontology of this contested heterocultural moment. For both of them, too, a kind of metaphysical incompatibility between whiteness and anything else, anything different, supplies a trump card. As I've said, Cameron plays it in his unidirectional racialization of extremism, so as to exclude Muslims from the fading prestige of that whiteness, and it's also audible in the tram, despite Emma's token inclusion of Poles in her list of alien targets. Of course, there are differences. There are differences of emphasis, differences of focus between them, but we have to be prepared to address their convergence and the overlapping space that it reveals. That intersection has been the home to Britain's politics of race and racism for a very, very long time now. And I didn't actually think that this would still have to be pointed out. So let me be really blunt as I conclude. Britain's anti-Nazi past does not render its anxious, economically stalled citizenry immune to the protean seductions of fascism today. Emma's rant is not the spontaneous outpouring of an injured white working class that some uncomprehending or ignorant commentariat would have you believe. It's the effect of an accumulated racism and misogyny which have been significant, if fluctuating, presence in British political life since the end of World War II, at least. That persistence may be an embarrassment now, but the instruction customarily paired with it, go back to where you come from, has lost nothing of its timeless force and comes close to providing a constant point of reference and of orientation in the analysis of racial discourse even today. Whether that neurotic imperative is now a vestige of the past, or whether its contemporary currency is a harbinger of some frightful things to come, is in our hands. Securing the former outcome cannot be entrusted to the caprices of this country's political class. Right or left, they remain prisoners of a disabling deficit of historical information. As a result, they seem destined to imagine that popular racism, either dog-whistled with a smirk or anxiously recoded as culture and civilization, can be politically deployed without significant collateral damage. In that, they are dangerously wrong. If there are to be no more David Copelands or Anders Breivits, we must break that habit, but it will not be easy. Capitalism's protracted divorce from democracy involves a transition that will multiply the historic perils of popular racism, which had always provided a means to test the durability of their association. And the integrity of our ebbing democracy is at stake in the responses that we offer to that danger. Thank you very much.